Sometimes life throws you a moment so unexpected that it makes you pause, breathe differently, maybe even see yourself through someone else's eyes for the first time in years. Before I get into what happened that afternoon in the hallway, let me just say, if you're watching this from your living room, your porch, or maybe your kitchen table with a cup of coffee, tell me, where are you watching from? I love hearing from people all over. And if you enjoy stories that remind you that life still has surprises waiting, go ahead and subscribe. Give this video a like. It really helps me know I'm not the only one out here feeling these things. All right, let me tell you what really happened. It was a quiet Thursday, the kind of day that hums with ordinary life. The dishwasher was running, a faint smell of coffee still lingered in the air, and the light coming through the hallway window had that golden, forgiving glow that only late afternoons seem to carry. My husband, Daniel, had invited one of his colleagues over to pick up some documents. He'd mentioned him before. Mark, a man about my husband's age, maybe a few years younger, quiet but observant. I hadn't met him in person until that day. I remember hearing the low rumble of male voices from Daniel's study, followed by the sound of laughter. I was arranging some photo frames in the hallway, little snapshots of our life over the years, when I saw Mark step out first. He must have been looking for the restroom because he paused halfway down the hall and smiled when he saw me. "Mrs. Hale?" he said, his tone polite but warm. "Daniel told me you'd be here. I'm sorry I got turned around. This house feels like a maze." I laughed. "You're not the first to say that. And please, it's Laura." He smiled again, and there was something thoughtful in it, not forward, not inappropriate, but kind, the sort of expression you don't expect from someone you've just met. I noticed he was holding a folder loosely in one hand, his jacket draped over his arm, and his sleeves were rolled just above the elbows, a small, unguarded detail that made him seem more human than my husband's colleague. As we stood there, the air between us felt unusually still, like the world had briefly quieted to let something small and unseen pass between us. He looked at the photos on the wall, Daniel and I at the lake, our daughter at her graduation, and said softly, "You've built a beautiful life here." It was such a simple thing to say, but for some reason it touched me. Maybe because lately I'd been wondering about that very thing, about what happens after you've built your life, and the days all start to blend together. "Thank you," I said, smiling, though I could hear the faint tremor in my own voice. "It's been a long road." He nodded, studying one of the photos. "I can see that. You look proud in this one." He pointed to a picture of Daniel and me from our younger years, my hair darker, his smile wider. For a brief second, I wasn't 60, wasn't surrounded by quiet routines and soft sighs of age. I was that woman again, full of certainty and promise. "You must love what you do," I said, trying to ease the strange heaviness in my chest. "Daniel speaks highly of you." "I try my best," he replied, then hesitated. "He talks about you too." "Does he?" I asked, a little surprised. Mark nodded. "Mostly about your patience. He says you're the reason he can focus the way he does." I laughed quietly. "Well, that's one way to describe putting up with his late nights." He chuckled too, and for a second we both lingered there in that narrow hallway, sunlight stretching between us, glinting off the picture frames. It felt like an oddly intimate place, not because of closeness, but because of quiet recognition. Two people who understood something unspoken about time, about how it changes us. Then Daniel's voice called out from the study, "Mark, you still here?" Mark straightened, his expression softening back into polite composure. "Guess that's my cue," he said, giving me a small nod. "It was really nice meeting you, Laura." "You too," I said, though part of me wanted to ask him something, maybe about life or time, or how he managed to still look like he had places to go. But I stayed silent. He turned to leave, and for just a heartbeat, he paused again, glancing back. "You have a peaceful house," he said quietly, "but I get the feeling you miss the noise." I didn't answer. Maybe I didn't have to. He smiled once more, then disappeared down the hallway toward Daniel's voice. After he left, I stood there for a long time, staring at that same photograph, the one of me smiling at the camera, sun on my face, a younger woman who didn't know yet that one day she'd measure time by silences and memories. That evening, as the house settled into its usual stillness, I found myself thinking about how a simple moment, a glance, a tone, a shared silence, could awaken something you thought had gone quiet long ago. And that was the first time I realized that sometimes the most unexpected connections aren't about romance at all. They're about being seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. But that day in the hallway, that was only the beginning. I didn't expect to see Mark again so soon. After that quiet afternoon in the hallway, I figured he'd just fade into the background of my husband's work life. Another face from the office, another polite "how are you" at some company dinner, I'd probably skip. But life has its way of looping people back to you, especially when you least expect it. It was about 2 weeks later when Daniel mentioned over breakfast that he'd invited a few colleagues for a casual dinner that Friday. Just something small, he said between bites of toast. "Mark will be there, along with a couple of others from the office. You'll like them." I pretended to be indifferent, but I felt a small pulse of curiosity, or maybe anticipation. I wasn't sure why. All I knew was that when Friday came, I found myself paying a little more attention to the details, the table setting, the lighting, even the music. It wasn't vanity. It was a sense of wanting things to feel alive again, even just for one night. By 7, the house was filled with the familiar murmur of voices and laughter. Daniel was in his element, telling stories that made his colleagues chuckle politely. I floated between the kitchen and the living room, refilling glasses, adjusting plates, smiling in all the right moments. And then he walked in. Mark was the last to arrive, apologizing for being late. He looked the same as before, calm, steady, somehow grounded. But there was a different kind of awareness between us now, something small but undeniable, like a song only the two of us could hear. "Evening, Laura," he said with that gentle voice, handing me a bottle of wine. "Thought you might like this." "Thank you," I said, accepting it. "You remembered I like red?" He smiled, his eyes catching mine for a moment longer than they should have. I pay attention. Dinner passed in a blur of conversation. Work stories, light jokes, Daniel's booming laugh echoing across the table. Every now and then, I'd catch Mark's glance from across the room. Not deliberate, not improper, just knowing. Like he understood something about me that no one else at that table did. Later, after everyone had eaten, the group drifted into the living room. The men started talking about a new project, the kind of technical talk that went over my head. I slipped back into the kitchen to tidy up, grateful for the quiet. That's when I heard the soft sound of footsteps behind me. "Need a hand?" It was Mark, standing at the doorway, sleeves rolled again, that same easy calm around him. "I've got it," I said, though I didn't really. "But thank you." He stepped closer, not too close, just enough that I could feel the faint shift in the air between us. He picked up a plate from the counter, drying it carefully before setting it aside. "You always this thoughtful?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Only when someone deserves it," he replied, and the way he said it made me look at him. Really look. There was no teasing in his eyes, no flirtation. Just a kind of quiet sincerity that both comforted and unsettled me. We worked in silence for a few moments, the sound of running water filling the space. Then he said almost casually, "You seem different than I expected." "How so?" He hesitated. "Daniel talks about you a lot, but he doesn't capture you. You're more alive than he realizes." I froze for a moment, unsure how to respond. Compliments at 60 aren't something you expect, not like that. And yet there was no edge to his words, no hidden motive. Just truth, simple and unadorned. Life has a way of quieting you, I finally said. Sometimes you forget what being alive even feels like. He nodded slowly, drying another glass. Until something, or someone, reminds you. For a moment, the air seemed to hum between us, the kind of silence that holds too much meaning to break. And then Daniel's laugh carried from the living room, pulling the spell apart. Mark smiled faintly, placing the towel down. "You make a good home here," he said softly. "I hope you know that." "I try," I murmured. He turned to leave but paused, resting his hand briefly on the doorway. "Sometimes trying isn't the same as living, Laura. Don't forget that." When he was gone, I leaned against the counter, my heart beating harder than it should have. Not because of attraction, but because his words hit somewhere deep, somewhere I hadn't visited in years. That night, after everyone left and Daniel was already asleep, I stood alone in the kitchen, staring out the window. The house was quiet again, too quiet. And for the first time, I felt the stillness not as peace, but as absence. Mark's words echoed in my head. Trying isn't the same as living. I didn't know what to do with that, but I knew I wouldn't forget it. Because deep down, I think he was right. The days after that dinner felt strangely different. Nothing visible had changed, yet something within me had shifted, almost imperceptibly at first, like a faint hum beneath the noise of ordinary life. I found myself thinking about small things again, noticing the scent of rain on the porch, the sound of my old clock ticking through quiet afternoons, the way sunlight moved across the living room rug. It was as if a part of me that had been asleep had stirred, blinking into wakefulness. Daniel was as busy as ever. Early mornings, late nights, phone calls at odd hours. We'd fallen into a rhythm years ago, comfortable but distant, like two trees rooted beside each other, but growing in opposite directions. I never resented it. That was just life. But after that dinner, I started noticing how quiet our evenings had become. How often we sat across from each other at the same table and barely spoke. It was one of those evenings when the phone rang. Daniel answered from the study, his tone brisk and professional, then called out, "Laura, could you hand me my folder from the hallway table? Mark's on the line. We're finalizing some figures." I picked up the folder, and before I could hand it over, I heard Daniel laugh. "Mark says hi, by the way," he added, distracted. "We might drop by the office this weekend. I'll let you know." I hesitated. "This weekend?" "Yeah," he said absently, already back into the call. And just like that, the conversation was over, but the thought lingered. Saturday came gray and quiet. Daniel left for the office early, promising to be home by lunch. I spent the morning tending to the small garden behind the house, pruning roses, brushing soil from my gloves, letting the air cool my face. It was peaceful, grounding, until I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Daniel said you might be out here." I turned, startled but not unwelcome. Mark stood by the back gate, holding a folder and wearing that same calm half-smile. He looked somehow more at ease than before, the kind of man comfortable with silence. "Oh," I said, brushing dirt from my hands. "He's not here. He went to the office." "I know," Mark said, stepping closer. He asked me to drop off some documents for him to review later. He held the folder out, but there was no rush in his gesture. I took it, careful not to brush his hand, though the nearness felt charged with something unsaid. "Thank you," I murmured. "You keep a lovely garden," he said, glancing around. "It's rare to see roses this healthy this time of year." "It's a bit of a battle, honestly," I replied. "They remind me that effort still matters, even when things don't bloom easily." He smiled softly. "I think that says more about you than the flowers." For a while we simply stood there, two people in a quiet backyard, the air smelling faintly of earth and rain. The world felt suspended. There was no pretense, no awkwardness, just a shared moment of stillness that didn't need explanation. I used to love days like this, I said finally, more to myself than to him. Now they just make me think of time passing. Maybe that's the point, he said quietly. To remember it's still passing, which means you're still in it. His words landed somewhere deep, a gentle ache that was both painful and freeing. You talk like someone who's been through something, I said. He gave a small, thoughtful nod. I lost my wife 3 years ago. She used to say the same thing. That time is only cruel if you stop living inside it. I felt my breath catch, my heart softening. I'm sorry, Mark. I didn't know. It's all right, he said. It changes you, but not all change is bad. It makes you see people differently, makes you listen more. There was something in the way he said that, quiet but sincere, that made me look at him differently too. Not as my husband's colleague, but as someone who understood loneliness, who'd met it face to face and kept walking anyway. We talked for a while longer, about the garden, about music, about the way people carry invisible seasons within them. It wasn't flirtation, it was recognition, a kind of honesty that had become rare in my life. Then the wind picked up, carrying a faint chill. I crossed my arms, rubbing them lightly. Mark noticed and glanced toward the house. Would you mind if I come in for a moment? I have a few more notes for Daniel's report. It'll only take a minute. Of course, I said, leading him through the back door. Inside, the house felt different with him there. Quieter, but fuller somehow. He placed his folder on the kitchen counter, flipping through a few pages as I poured us both some tea, a reflex, really, from years of hosting. As I handed him the cup, his fingers brushed mine briefly, unintentionally perhaps, but it lingered longer than it should have. Our eyes met for a heartbeat. No words, just that shared silence again. He took a sip, looking down at the cup as if to steady himself. You have a warmth about you, Laura. People don't always notice their own light, but it's there. I felt my throat tighten, not from emotion exactly, but from the unfamiliarity of being seen that way. You say that like you've been looking for it. He smiled faintly. Maybe I have. Before I could respond, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the stillness. Daniel was home. Mark set down his cup, his tone returning to its easy calm. I should get going. He gathered his papers, nodded to me once, and walked toward the door. Just before he stepped outside, he turned slightly. For what it's worth, I think those roses are perfect. They don't try to be anything they're not. They just keep growing. Then he was gone. I stood there for a long time after, the soft hum of the house filling the space he'd left behind. I looked out the window at the garden, the roses swaying gently in the breeze, and realized that something had taken root inside me too. It wasn't desire, not even longing. It was awakening, the slow, tender realization that it's never too late to feel alive again. And though I didn't know what it meant, I knew this. Something in me had begun to change, quietly, like the first bloom after a long winter. It had been almost a month since that morning in the garden. Life had settled back into its careful rhythm. Daniel's work calls, the hum of the dishwasher, my walks in the evening when the sky turned that soft, forgiving blue. From the outside, everything looked the same. But inside, I felt different. Not restless, not lost. Just awake. I hadn't seen Mark since that day. Sometimes I'd catch myself wondering if he'd stop by again, maybe for work, maybe by coincidence. But weeks passed, and silence grew where conversation had been. Still, his words lingered like gentle echoes. Trying isn't the same as living. It was early autumn when I saw him again. Daniel had mentioned a company event, a small gathering to celebrate the end of a long project, and he'd insisted I come. Everyone's bringing their partners, he said, waving a hand. "It'll be good for you to get out of the house." Part of me hesitated. I wasn't sure I wanted to step back into that world, all polite chatter and practiced smiles. But another part of me, the part that had started noticing sunsets again, wanted to go. So I did. The event was held at a quiet restaurant by the river, the kind of place with soft lighting and music that didn't compete with conversation. I wore a dark blue dress I hadn't touched in years. It felt strange, wearing something that once belonged to a younger, more confident version of myself, but when I looked in the mirror, I saw a softness that age hadn't erased, a different kind of grace, one earned through time. When we arrived, Daniel was immediately swept into conversation. I stood by the window, gazing at the water shimmering beneath the lights. That's when I felt someone approach beside me. "Blue suits you," a voice said quietly. I turned. Mark. He looked almost the same, maybe a little more tired, a little more human. His smile was gentle, not surprised, just knowing. "I didn't think you'd come," he said. "Neither did I admitted. For a moment, we simply stood there, watching the slow movement of the river outside. It felt peaceful, familiar, like returning to a conversation we both silently agreed to pause weeks ago. "How have you been?" I asked. "Busy," he said, then after a pause, "but not too busy to think." I smiled faintly. "Thinking can be dangerous." He nodded. "So can forgetting." There was a quiet between us, not awkward, not forbidden, just full of the things neither of us needed to say out loud. Around us, laughter and clinking glasses filled the air, but we were somewhere else entirely. He turned to me then, his expression thoughtful. "You seem lighter," he said softly, "like you've let something go." "Maybe I have," I replied, "or maybe I've just remembered something I forgot, that I'm still here." He smiled, the kind of smile that says he understands exactly what you mean. "I'm glad," he said. "You deserve to feel alive." We talked a little longer, about small things, safe things, until Daniel came over, placing a friendly hand on Mark's shoulder. "Good to see you two catching up," he said cheerfully. "Mark's been a lifesaver on this project." Mark chuckled. "Just doing my job." They shared a brief exchange about work, and I stood there, half listening, half lost in the soft hum of the room. Then Daniel was called away again, leaving us in that familiar, suspended quiet. "I should probably go," Mark said after a moment. "Early morning tomorrow." I nodded. "Of course." But as he turned to leave, he hesitated, then leaned in slightly, not close enough to cross a line, just close enough that his words felt private. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think you found what you were looking for. You don't need anyone to wake you up anymore." I met his eyes, and for a moment I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not for romance, not for excitement, but for recognition, for being seen when I'd stopped seeing myself. "Thank you, Mark," I said quietly, "for reminding me." He smiled once more, that same quiet, steady smile, then walked away, blending into the low hum of conversation. I watched him go, feeling neither loss nor longing, just peace. Later that night, when Daniel and I drove home, the city lights reflected softly off the car window. He talked about work, about how the evening went, and I listened, really listened, with a calm I hadn't felt in years. When we reached home, I stepped out onto the porch for a moment before going inside. The air was cool, filled with the scent of damp earth and leaves. The garden was still, the roses faint silhouettes in the dim light, but I could almost see them breathing, quietly enduring the change of seasons. And in that stillness, I realized something simple but true, that growth doesn't always come from the storms. Sometimes it comes from the gentle touch of a moment that wakes you from sleep, reminding you that your life, even at 60, still has room to bloom. I turned off the porch light and went inside, smiling to myself. The house didn't feel quiet anymore. It just felt alive.